Thursday night, politics later than Bill now on BBC One, as you join Fiona Bruce.
Tonight we're in Glasgow. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Kirstene Hair, a former politics student elected as a Conservative MP in 2017 and a member of Commons committees on Scottish Affairs and Women and Equalities. Labour's shadow international trade secretary, born and raised here in Glasgow, Barry Gardiner. Humza Yousaf, the youngest MSP to be appointed to the Scottish Cabinet and the first Muslim, now Justice Secretary for the SNP. Journalist, author and early supporter of the pro-independence think tank Commonweal, Angela Haggerty. And businessman and chief executive of the PR group Cicero, Iain Anderson. Welcome to our panel, to you here in the audience and, of course, to you at home. You can argue along in the usual way. You know how to do it by now, using hashtag BBCQT on Facebook, on Instagram and on Twitter. So join in the conversation. Right. Let's have our first question, shall we? Which is from Samuel Fotheringham.
Hi. First of all, congratulations to my brother Ryan and Gemma on the birth of their baby nephew, my baby nephew today.
Congratulations! That's amazing. And your question?
And with that, with Iain Anderson telling Labour voters to vote Tory and umpteen other inter-party fallouts, how can we trust yous if yous can't trust each other?
Barry, why don't you kick us off on this one?
You shouldn't take everything we say at face value. You should weigh it. You should weigh it. You should judge exactly what we say on the evidence that we give you. And I think it's really important that when you see people like Iain, look, Iain
Do you want to just remind us what Iain Anderson has said?
I think you've probably got the quote. I don't have it. But he was not very complimentary about Jeremy Corbyn.
He said Mr Corbyn is unfit to leave the country and called him a disgrace.
And he said that he would personally be voting for Boris Johnson.
Obviously a former Labour MP
look,
now.
Let me just set this in context, OK? Because Iain Anderson was, this was billed as, former Labour minister says this. Iain Anderson has been a member of the party for many months. He's been disaffected for quite some time. He was a minister 10 years ago, and he said this. Contrast that to Nicky Morgan, who is still the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, who wrote saying that she didn't believe that right-wing Brexiteers like Boris Johnson should be in government at all, and yet that's not a headline. Why? I think it's not a headline. I think it's not a headline because the people who own our broadsheet newspapers know that actually Labour might well win this election. And they know that if we do, there will be such a transfer in the balance of power in this country in favour not of the elite but of ordinary people, that they're afraid of that. And that's what I think is going on. So yes, you're going to see lots of scare stories, lots of fake news in this election. There will be. But ultimately what the people of this country have got to weigh and judge is who is going to make their lives better. Who is actually going to transform this country and bring about real change? Change in terms of childcare, change in terms of the health service, change in terms of violent crime. And if you look at what has happened with the cuts to public services over the past 9 years under Boris Johnson's Tories, then actually I think the choice is clear, and I think people will make that choice to vote Labour.
And Kirstene, you know, Barry put on the spot there with the comments made by Iain Anderson and actually John Woodcock today, but when you look at the Conservatives, obviously there are a fair few Conservatives who've voted with their feet. They just left the party.
So the comments from Iain Austin today outlined that absolutely what is true. Jeremy Corbyn is absolutely unfit to be the Prime Minister of this country.
But the question is also about other party fallouts, including your own.
I will come on to that point. And not only did Iain Austin say that he was unfit to be Prime Minister, but he put the economy and jobs at risk, and that his Brexit deal was a fantasy. It was scathing. And Iain Austin didn't just say vote Boris Johnson. He went as far to say vote Boris Johnson. He didn't just say vote for the candidate that keeps Jeremy Corbyn out. He actually believes that Boris Johnson is the best person to be Prime Minister. We also saw the Jewish Chronicle front page this morning suggesting that 87% of Jews felt frightened by a Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. 47% saying that they would emigrate if Jeremy Corbyn were Prime Minister. This is absolutely damning. And I recognise that there are MPs in my party that have stood down as well. But they haven't stood down or cited Boris Johnson in their letters. They have cited personal reasons or there's a whole variety of reasons why people stand down.
Quite a few have gone to other parties.
They've been thrown out.
That's a bit of an indictment, you've got to say.
They've been thrown out.
They've gone to other parties. So they don't need to mention Boris Johnson, they just left.
Ken Clarke was thrown out. Philip Hammond was thrown out.
And
David Gauke was thrown out. The idea that they've just left to do other things. I mean, you know, yes, we've had people, you're absolutely right, who've been disaffected for years, one way or another, and they've bitterly then said what they did. But we weren't throwing people out of the party in the way that you did.
Well, I'm not sure that Luciana Berger would say that. But what I would say in this election is that it's a very clear choice. It's a choice between Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, getting a Brexit deal, focusing on public services and saying no to Nicola Sturgeon's second independence referendum that she wants to rerun next year. The opposite option is Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, with Nicola Sturgeon propping him up. 2 referendums next year, more delay, more dithering, not delivering on that referendum result, and the billions that Jeremy Corbyn said that he was going to borrow in order to spend across our country would leave us with the highest level of borrowing since the 1960s. It's to vote Conservative will move this country forward, respect both referendum results and make sure that we focus on the issues that really matter.
You'd never think there was an election happening, would you? Right, there's lots of hands up. Gosh, where shall I start? The woman there in the top with the poppy.
I'm just rather confused when they talk about the amount of money that's going to be spent, like on the NHS and things like that, and they're going to throw this money right, left and centre. But a lot of powers have already been devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So surely for the Scottish people, it's not how much money is going to be going to the NHS, etc. It really boils down to, do you want independence or not?
I think we're going to come on to that in a minute. I'm going to take a few questions from a number of you to begin with, if I may. Yes, the man here in the front.
Boris Johnson misled the Queen. To me, he should not be the Prime Minister. I have a lot of respect for Kenneth Clarke as a Tory MP, and he was kicked out of the Tory party. So I think you have to appreciate that the Tory party is now a right-wing party. It's not a one-nation party.
I think the lady really hit delivered the point home. I think the Labour Party has a huge credibility issue on its hands. It's rife with anti-Semitism. It's the only party aside from the BNP that's been investigated by the Equality Commission. And, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, here's a man who invariably sides with the enemies of Britain, and he has been a completely ineffective leader of opposition. He could have been in power by now, and he clearly has failed at every single opportunity. How can we trust him?
I'll come back to you on that in a moment, Barry. The woman there.
Boris Johnson described Corbyn as like Stalin. He's not fit to govern. Boris Johnson is not fit to govern in the UK. That's disgusting.
And the woman here in the front.
You said that Jewish people are scared to go out of their house because Corbyn's an anti-Semite. I'm Jewish, my whole family's Jewish. I can tell you that we're not scared. Corbyn is not an anti-Semite. The right-wing press takes things out of context, puts them in headlines, and that's never spoken about by the party. They vilify Corbyn in the press and attack him as a person, whereas talk about his policies 7% of the time, but 80% of Tory policies are talked about in the press. Why is that? Attack the character instead of the policies, because the policies are correct.
Yeah.
I know you both want to come back on some of those things, but I just want to ask the rest of the panel in terms of the original question, with Iain Anderson telling Labour voters to vote Tory, umpteen other inter-party fallouts. How can we trust you if you can't trust each other? Humza?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't trust Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn to run a bath, let alone run the country.
But you're going to pack.
But let me say this, actually. For the first 24, 48 hours of this campaign, what have we seen? Not just mistrusts and mistruths, but actually we've seen some of the most shameful things said. Take Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments, for example, about those who lost their lives in Grenfell. He shouldn't be standing as a candidate. You shouldn't be allowed to get away with that. So this is not just... So in the first 24, 48 hours, you've had the most shameful comments from Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've had the Tories doctoring a video of Keir Starmer. You've had Jeremy Corbyn compared to Stalin. You've had a Russian dossier of electoral interference potentially not being released. You've had a minister resign due to him knowing an aide deliberately sabotaged a rape trial, according to the judge.
Allegedly.
I said allegedly. I did say allegedly. You can check that in the tape. You've had Tom Watson, the deputy leader, resign from Labour. And then you've had Ian Austin with his comments. Actually, the lady was absolutely right with the poppy in the front row. How on earth, and you know my views on independence, right? But how on earth you can look down at Westminster and go, that's the best we can do? That is not the best we can do. And this election is about sending a very clear message from Scotland that we can do better. And you know what? We want the right to choose for ourselves and choose a much better path, because we can do far better than that omni shambles down at Westminster.
Yeah.
So, congratulations to Samuel on your new offspring. What a time to bring a child into the world in the middle of all this. I think the problem with this election, candidly, is we've got Hobson's choice. You know, I mean, we've just been listening to some of this right now. You asked us about trust, and I think one of the fundamental problems that we all have as voters, I'm not a politician, right now is looking at the calibre of political leaders that we have in front of us in this election. Frankly, none of them are good enough. None of them are good enough. You know, I worked, I got my suede shoes on tonight, so I worked a bit with Ken Clarke. I tried desperately to get him elected as leader of the Tory party. If the Tory party had taken that direction... Well, well, hey, I wasn't asking you to do that necessarily, but I think potentially our politics would be in a better place. Humza talks about Jacob Rees-Mogg. I think the problem in this election is the Tory party looks like it's lost its heart, and the Labour Party
it had a heart. It had a heart.
Well, no,
been used to folk in this part of the city.
Humza, you know, Ken Clarke, absolutely. Nicky Morgan, absolutely. And I look at the kind of calibre of politicians, whether it was Ken or Gordon Brown or Paddy Ashdown, agree with them or not, those kind of people, our politicians, ain't what they used to be. I think that's the problem in this election.
Angela?
I have so much sympathy with the public, because I think there are so many massive choices that need to be made right now. And the options that people have in front of them, I think, leave a lot to be desired. You've used a word which I had actually written down, calibre. And it really does feel like the calibre of politician is just not up to scratch when it comes to dealing with the problems that we've got. I mean,
are you including the people on our panel?
Just say yes and get it over with.
I'm sorry. So that the masochism strategy?
But, well, I mean, in terms of Labour, I don't know if people remember back to when we had the vote on the EU referendum on Brexit and the days after, you know, if you're a political geek like me, you would have been watching the news constantly. And it very quickly turned from the Brexit vote into this internal war within the Labour Party, where again, Labour politicians were trying to oust their leader. And this was in the aftermath of something that was the beginning of one of the biggest crises that this country has ever seen outside of wartime. I mean, it was incredible. Where are your priorities? This is inter-party, this is domestic politics, and you're all fighting about this while the world is basically on fire around you. I mean, it's incredible what we've had to endure, I think, for the last 3 years. And I think that the public are right to feel like they want their politicians to just get their acts together and find a way through this. And I feel, as I say, I feel great sympathy for the public that it feels like even now it's still, you know, we're still in the midst of just all of this infighting, and it's frustrating to keep having to watch this.
So I'd just like to repeat what Humza had already said about Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments and the fact that Andrew Bridgen had been on the media to try and spin for Jacob Rees-Mogg and managed to say something equally as offensive as far as I'm concerned. I'd also like to echo the point that Barry had made about the difference in how people are being portrayed. Because not only has, you said Nicky Morgan had made comments about the Tory leadership, but Ken Clark said that he's got no trust in Boris Johnson after having been flung from the party. And just with regards to what Kirstene was saying about the Jewish Chronicle also this week ran an op-ed from a well-regarded senior rabbi who was basically imploring people to think about what they were reading, including in the Jewish Chronicle, and emphasising that time and time again, history has shown, number one, Jeremy Corbyn stands up for the Jewish people and Jewish communities, and number two, violence against the Jews comes from the far right.
Yeah.
Humza, you're saying that this election is a choice for people in Scotland to make their voices clear to Westminster. We made our voices clear in 2014 and we want to stay apart.
Things have changed. I'm sorry, things have changed.
Well, let's come on to that in a moment. I just want to come back to...
I don't think the world is the same as it was in 2014.
I just want to come back to Kirstene and Barry, because there were a lot of things said from the audience to begin with. Kirstene, did you want to give a response to some of the things that people were saying just now?
Yeah, and I will face them head on, because I think that's what the public want. They want their politicians to say what they really think. And I think that what Jacob Rees-Mogg said was absolutely out of order. And I am, and I have done before, I have said when, well, there's a general election coming up, Humza, that's when the people of North East Somerset will be able to determine
why should you even be allowed to stand as a candidate?
Well, to be fair, I didn't interrupt you, so if you could let me finish.
Why should you be allowed to stand
so,
as a candidate?
And I
answer that question, Kirstene?
Yeah, answer it.
I did answer, and I've said that actually we've got an election on December the 12th. That's when the people of North East Somerset will be able to determine whether they would like Jacob Rees-Mogg as their MP or not. We've got an election coming up in 6 weeks' time. I think it's up to the public to decide. But what I would say, if you would let me finish my sentence, is that I am quite happy to say when people on my side say something that is wrong, I will say that is out of order. If you have made a group of people feel alienated in any way or upset somebody, what you have said is wrong. But also, we've got to remember that people in all parties have to stand up and say when people in their party say or do something that's wrong. So in Barry's party, you know, that what John McDonnell said about my colleague, that should have been called out as wrong. There are a whole plethora of things that elected... When John McDonnell said that Esther McVey, my colleague, should be lynched, I think was the comment he made, and it wasn't called out. It wasn't called out by the leadership. And there are a whole range of things that elected SNP representatives have said, and they're not called out by the First Minister of Scotland. We are role models in our communities. People look to us to see how, and if we act in such a way, then that becomes normalised. When people say something is wrong, I was always brought up that you put your hand up and say that you're wrong, but people from all sides need to call out all sides and recognise that we are in a role in public office and we should respect that.
Barry, there are a number of points made, obviously.
If I can just pick up briefly on some of the points. The gentleman who said that Jeremy Corbyn was an ineffective leader. In fact, this government has been defeated 47 times under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the opposition, which is more times than any other government has ever been defeated. So ineffective is not the appropriate word. You may disagree with his policies, you may disagree with the Labour Party on many fronts, but on that, we've been an effective opposition. I wanted to just pick up on what was being said. Saida Varsi said, and I quote her, "We lost the moral high ground on racism a long time ago." She said that about the Conservative Party. And I did think it was rich for Humza to when he was talking about the different things that have been going on, to talk about trials of sexual misconduct.
Please don't weaponise. Please don't weaponise.
That's what you
sexual. No. I didn't. I give a fact that a minister resigned. Do not use. And if you've ever talked to a survivor of sexual offences or rape, please do not come in the show and weaponise sexual offending or rape. That is beyond the pale of politics. Well, do not do that.
You're interrupting everybody very well, but let me just tell you that you raised this by giving the example of a court case that had gone wrong because somebody had interfered in it, and it was a sexual offence that the court case was about. You did that, not me, and I'm just saying I think you've got quite a bit of chutzpah given the court case that is going to be coming in January this year.
Iain, you're...
Just really quickly, I mean, surely in this election campaign, politicians, we can do better than this. No. We can do better than this. Yeah. I mean... We are 3 or 4 days into this, and the mud is flying around and around and around. Can we just talk about the policies?
Well, hang on, Barry, in fairness.
The question didn't invite...
The original question for you, Samuel, when you weren't mentioning your nephew's newborn, was about trust. And actually, I just want to say, because I think it's important, that last week I misheard a question and gave the impression that Vote Leave had not broken electoral law during the EU referendum. That should have been picked up. In fact, it was fined £61,000 by the Electoral Commission. And, of course, Leave.eu was also fined for electoral offences. So I just want to make that clear. And before we go on to our next question, I just want to tell you where we're going to be next week, which is Brighton. And then we're going to be in Bolton. And if you'd like to be in the audience, call 0330 123 9988 or go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. So come along and join in. We'd love to see you. Let's go to our next question. Let's raise the tone, as Iain has called for. Jennifer Mortimer.
If the SNP win the majority of Scottish seats at the next election, is this a mandate for another referendum on independence?
Hamza?
We already have a mandate for another independence referendum. We have a mandate because, of course, in the 2016 elections to Scottish Parliament, we stood on a manifesto that said, literally, you can check it, go online. It says that if we were elected and if Scotland was dragged out of the European Union against its will, then we would have the right for another referendum. Not only that, the Scottish Parliament, by majority, has voted for another independence referendum. And who the heck does Boris Johnson think he is? Coming here, flying into Scotland, having a dram. Tories haven't won an election here in Scotland for over 60 years. And look, I respect the fact that in this question time audience, some of the audience is going to be pro-independence, some of the audience, of course, is going to be anti-independence. But surely to heck, we are all Democrats, that if the Scottish Parliament votes for another independence referendum, if Scotland sends a whole swathe and a slate of SNP MPs, then surely any Democrat, whether you're yes or whether you're no, it should be for the Scottish people to decide their future, not some arrogant, out-of-touch Tory MP that has PM that has no mandate here.
And Humza, if Labour were to win a significant number of seats, would the SNP do a deal with Labour in order to get to...
Absolutely.
Listen, I am going to do whatever I can, and we will do whatever we can to get Boris Johnson out of number 10. You can trust me on that.
So does that mean yes? Does that mean yes? That you will go into some form of arrangement?
I will work with, not a formal coalition, not at all, but we work in a progressive alliance, be it with Labour, Plaid Cymru, the Greens. And in fairness to Barry, in fairness to Jeremy Corbyn, he said, I don't agree with independence, I don't want there to be another vote, but it is for the Scottish people to determine whether or not they want another say on their future. That, at the very least, in fairness to Barry, and in fairness to Jeremy Corbyn, is the democratic position.
What's going to happen, Barry, in terms of Labour's position with a second independence referendum?
I was born here in Glasgow. I was raised in Glasgow. I now live in England. I would be devastated if Scotland ever left the United Kingdom. But look, I recognise that it is for the Scottish people ultimately to decide that.
So
now,
if you were in power, when might you let them decide that?
Can I just say, my wife's English. I've got a son who works in Scotland. I've got children who work in England. They think of themselves as British. And I believe that we're stronger as a family together, just as England and Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom are stronger as a family together. So I will do everything I can to uphold the union that we have. But I'll do it with respect. And make no mistake, if we have a right-wing Boris Johnson Tory government, I can see nothing that would turbocharge the mood for independence more than that. So I say to everybody who cares about the union here in Scotland, and everybody who cares about the union in England, in Wales, in the rest of the country, make sure that in the election you vote Labour, because it's the only way of protecting the union. Now, Humza's given us a challenge. And I understand why he wants to talk about constitutional politics, right? Because constitutional politics is a huge distraction from everyday politics. And you've only got to look at the record of the SNP here in Scotland. You know,
three terms.
Will Kerr,
historically,
Deputy Chief Constable, warning that 700 police officers may need to lose their jobs because Mr Humza's budget. Police Scotland is one of the poorest funded in the UK.
Let's not have a very long list.
Okay.
No, excuse me. We have 1,000 more officers in Scotland, and England has cut 20,000 officers.
So hang on, the question, though, just to be old-fashioned, to come back to it, if the SNP win the majority of seats at the election, is this a mandate for another independence referendum? What I just want us to understand, you're saying you very much want to keep the union, but you would treat Scotland with respect. You've got the Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, saying that if at the next Scottish Government elections, if the Scottish Government determines it wants to pursue another referendum, we would not stand in their way. So does that mean, then, that if the SNP were to win at the Scottish elections, Labour would say, OK, you can have your independence referendum?
What we've said is this, that it is not a priority for the first few years of a Labour government. Let me tell you why we said that. Well, let me tell you.
2, 5?
What it means is that once a Labour government has come in and changed the balance of power in this country, has actually got public services working again against the cuts that the Tories put in place, then I believe that people will not feel the need as they did previously in 2014 when the Yes campaign was thinking maybe the only way to get out from under a Tory government is to get independence. And if you looked yesterday, you know, it was Sean Bailey, you know, from the Tenants Union, who came out and recognised that actually a progressive Labour government could transform Scotland as well as the rest of the country, in a way that meant that people didn't see independence as being the only way out from Tory domination.
OK, let's hear from our audience. The man here in the blue shirt.
While we've got Boris Johnson still as Prime Minister or if he's elected, re-elected as Prime Minister, we're never going to get independence in Scotland because he treats Scotland with contempt. He stood up at the desk, he stood up in Parliament and said, if Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, doesn't get her act together with the National Health, we'll take it back under Westminster control. Boris Johnson can't be trusted.
Absolutely.
He's a prolific liar.
Yeah.
And he'll bring the country... He started off his campaign yesterday with 5 lies. The first lie was he didn't want an election. He asked 3 times for an election.
He said he felt he was forced into it. The woman there in the glasses.
Barry Gardiner says that he's devastated at the idea of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. I think a lot of Scotland are devastated at leaving the EU against their will. And in 2014, I was a very avid no voter, but if I was given the vote again, I would want to be independent if it meant that we would be in the EU.
The woman at the very back. The woman at the very... OK, let's hear from you, and then we'll hear from the woman behind you.
I just very much like to echo what the lady has said. I'm devastated at the thought of Scotland leaving the EU. The people of Scotland were promised in 2014 that if we voted to remain within the United Kingdom, that we would remain within the EU. That is now not the case. Therefore, I do not understand how the Westminster Government can turn down a request for a second and written opinion.
And the woman at the very back.
I think that we need more changes. You get politics talking about the same thing all the time on the news. I think we do need a huge change where the public are heard, and it's not... because it's coming to a point where every time it's just... we're not getting anywhere, it's always the same old thing, and public has to have a chance where we make the changes, not the government, because government and politics fight among each other and they're getting paid loads of money and they're selling a lot of our public services, which our NHS, police services, crime, we've not got much left because we're selling it and we're not going to have a good future. It'll be like a judgment day and terminating, more like, for us.
Kirstene, just coming back to the question from Jennifer. I mean, you've got Humza saying that if the SNP have a majority mandate, that's a mandate for an second independence referendum. Is that any different, realistically, from Boris Johnson saying that if the Conservatives win the election, they've got a mandate to put through Boris Johnson's Brexit deal?
So the election, the referendum, in 2014, we were told, not by me, by the SNP, that this was a referendum that was once in a generation, once in a lifetime. And 5 years is not a generation nor a lifetime. And what I believe is that we should stand by that decision. It was clearly made in 2014. We said no, we meant it, we want to stick by it, and Nicola Sturgeon needs to listen.
In 2014,
because in Humza, if you could just respect other people on this panel, because I don't interrupt you, if you could let me speak. There's a really important point
that the lady made, though. In 2014, we were also told if you vote no, your place in Europe will be protected. That was a lie. That was a lie.
With respect, Humza, there's absolutely no clarity on an independent Scotland rejoining the EU, and I'm not quite sure how Scotland becomes independent, leaving the UK and then rejoining the EU. So if you could let me finish the question. So I believe we should stick by that vote in 2014. And I also believe that there's a lot of things that have suffered in the last 5 years because of the focus on independence. Because whilst Nicola Sturgeon was out rallying with Humza in George Square here in Glasgow to the echo chamber of the SNP about independence in 2020, she was failing a generation of young people with our education system tumbling down the international league tables. We have the highest levels of violent crime in 4 years under Humza as Justice Secretary. We have a health system that is not meeting targets, specifically those that the SNP have set it itself. Treatment time guarantee in 12 weeks was set by the SNP in 2011 and has never been reached. They are failing many people across Scotland. We have a drugs crisis only on the periphery of my constituency in Dundee, the drugs capital of Europe. Nicola Sturgeon is so focused on independence that everything in the domestic agenda has been deprioritised. That's not the Scotland that we want to see. That's not governing. That's utilising your position to campaign for what your party wants. And I believe Boris Johnson does absolutely care about Scotland. He was up in Murray today. He was up in Murray today.
You lost it there.
He was up in Murray.
It was really good up to that point.
So he was up in Murray today, and one of the most important industries in Scotland, the whisky industry. And he was announcing a review of the whisky industry, which covers tens of thousands of jobs across the UK, a review in duty in the spirits industry. He will deliver a deal so that we can depart from the EU in a smooth and orderly manner.
What
and
do you think
he
of
will
that
say
response,
very firmly,
Kirstene?
he will say very firmly that Nicola Sturgeon, when she comes to ask for that Section 30 order, the end of this year, absolutely no, because we have made our decision. And the opposite, and this is the stark choice for the people in Scotland, is Nicola Sturgeon going to Jeremy Corbyn, who will be propped up by Nicola Sturgeon, who is willing to pave the way for a second independence referendum, have more dither and delay around EU with 2 referendums possibly next year. We as a country want to focus
3 years
because you've not voted for a deal through. Because you've not voted for a deal.
Okay, all right. Angela.
I can see Barry furiously nodding away in agreement with Kirstene here, and I feel like I'm in the middle of a Better Together reunion, Labour and the Tories united once again. But I mean, isn't it just wonderful how politicians can pick and choose their democracy? We were told in 2014, the EU, the relationship that Scotland might have with the EU was a big part of the debate. And the guarantee was that if Scotland voted to stay in the Union, that would be a vote to remain in the EU. Now, that changed within, less than 2 years. The goalposts were moved on Scotland on one of the biggest issues in IndyRef. That changes things. I'm sorry, but that changes things. That means that what we voted for is no longer on the table. Add into that we had 62% of people in Scotland vote to remain in the EU in the referendum. And I would point out, this is not just an issue of Scotland. Scotland is one of 4 parts of the UK, 2 of which voted to remain. Northern Ireland also voted to remain. There is a massive constitutional elephant in the room, and that is the inequality that exists between this apparent union of equals. It is not a union of equals. And it astonishes me when we have to sit and listen, and I'll give a bit of advice to unionists tonight. When we have to sit and listen to unionists more or less tell Scotland to get back in their box, when we point out in 2014 we were told this, we voted 62% to remain, to keep having it barked at is that we had our choice and that's it. No, despite the fact that we've had a Scottish election since then, we've had a snap election since then, the SNP had it in their manifesto that they wanted another referendum. It doesn't matter that they lost seats, Kirstene. Again, you're picking and choosing your democracy here. The SNP has won every election and they have this clearly in their mandate. So as I say, you can pick and choose your democracy, but you're taking the union, your union that you love, you're taking that down a very, very, very dangerous route, because what you're doing is you're alienating people in Scotland who feel that their voices aren't being heard. They're becoming more and more frustrated, and if this is the 3rd time that Scotland votes for a mandate, an election manifesto that has that mandate for another referendum in it, if they vote for it 3 times and your government still refuses to give them it, how is that democracy?
Do you want to answer that quickly before I come to Iain?
Well, very firmly, as I said, we had a referendum, we have to stick by that. But also, Nicola Sturgeon doesn't speak for Scotland. This is what infuriates the Scottish people, is that Nicola Sturgeon claims she speaks for the whole country.
But they keep voting for her, Kirstene.
For one party. No, well, actually, in 2017, 500,000 people, 500,000, who put a cross on the ballot paper for the SNP in 2015 couldn't face doing that in 2017. They all lost a whole swathe of seats.
Kirsten,
and there were
your government
13
lost its majority
Scottish
in that same
Conservative
election.
MPs who were elected to stand up to Nicola Sturgeon and to deliver for Scotland. And that's exactly what we've done.
Iain.
So, I mean, I didn't have a vote in 2014. Shouldn't have a vote. I don't live in Scotland anymore, but my family live here. I'm here every week. I have a lot of business here. I have a lot of work to do here, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. After the Brexit vote in 2016, for the first time, I swithered. I've always been a unionist, always believed in the United Kingdom, and I still do. But I did swither because it was a fundamental change. It was a fundamental change. It wasn't what was said in 2014. And for me, still, stepping back from the emotion, stepping back from the constant debate that we are having about our constitution, and that's not just a go at the SNP, that's just a go at our politics generally right now, Fiona. We just keep talking about the constitution rather than talking about education or the health service. It is a bit of a diversion, but I understand why it is. My question for those who believe in independence remains the question that was there, fundamentally there in 2014, and I still don't have the answer to it. And that's why I really don't cross that Rubicon. And what is that question? There were three issues, Fiona, that were top of Scots' minds in 2014. What's going to happen to our currency? What's going to happen to our pensions? And what's going to happen to our economy? It was just 2 weeks after IndyRef won, if we can call it that. I'm tempting fate. But the oil, and I come from Aberdeenshire, and the oil price fell off a cliff. And the North East economy is still recovering from that. It's reinventing, it's rewiring, it's having to do a lot to reinvent and rewire. It's quite tough for my friends and family in Aberdeenshire right now. But the fundamental question remains for me about the currency. I think the SNP's answer to that is that there would be a migration to a new currency. But until we get the answers, until we understand, all of us, whether or not we live down south or whether or not we live in Scotland, until we can really understand what an independent Scotland would look like, I just wouldn't take the gamble.
Okay. Let's hear from the woman in the pink sweater with the glasses.
I'm a bit fed up with all the politicians playing the blame game, and in particular the SNP, and I was just wondering, if you ever did get independence, who are you going to blame instead of Westminster?
The man in the striped shirt, then. Yes.
I'm English and I'm a student at Glasgow Uni, and I think Scottish independence would actually be good for the rest of the Union because it would force England to stop hiding behind the Union Jack and actually reevaluate what it means to be English in the 21st century.
Okay. And the woman next to you, you had your hand.
Yeah, I would like to say, you said we shouldn't make any decisions about independence because we don't know the three main facts around currency, etc. We have gone ahead and made a decision about Brexit knowing nothing. In 2016... As an Irish person, I am pro-independence, coming from Ireland. I totally believe in it. But what I would say is that you asked us to vote on a yes or no question in 2016, and yes, the democracy said we will leave the European Union. We knew nothing of what that was going to look like. We should be given, are entitled to know now that we have further more information, we should be allowed to vote on that again now that we have all the facts.
There's still quite a few hands up, I can see that, but I'm going to move on to another subject, if I may, because there were a lot of people who wanted to ask about this particular subject. It's actually something you've touched on as well, Kirsty. Anne Rose Bissett, where are you?
Why won't the Home Office reconsider the Misuse of Drugs Act to allow safe rooms for drug consumption?
So safe rooms, Anne-Rose, by those you mean rooms where addicts can go safely and take drugs or be given drugs under specialist medical supervision.
Yes.
And that's something that at the moment is not allowed in law. Angela, what's your view on this?
Yeah, there's been a lot of debate this week about the question of, well, the question of these rooms has been ongoing for a while, and there's also a lot of talk about decriminalisation. I think there's been a report from MPs which has recommended decriminalisation, and I think what we get to here is quite an ideological question about how the drugs issue should be dealt with, and it is terrible in Scotland. I think our drug deaths rates are absolutely through the roof. You know, some of the worst in Europe. It's
well, Scotland has the highest rate of drug-related deaths in the EU.
It's shocking, and if that doesn't call for a change of approach, I don't know what does. It puts me in mind actually of the Violence Reduction Unit, I believe it was called, and this was something that was very successful. I think it was just in Glasgow. It was piloted in Glasgow.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And what it did was it tackled knife crime, but it changed the focus of that. So instead of just treating it as a sort of purely criminal issue, it began to take a public health approach. So it started to look at the causes of these things. It started to look at early prevention, looking at the lives of the people that this was actually affecting and changing it from there. And it had massive success. And what that involved is people changing the way they think about people who are affected by this. So instead of looking at young people with knives and thinking that they're just criminals and thugs, you know, you could take a much more compassionate view and look at the circumstances that they're dealing with, the very challenging circumstances. The same thing has to happen with drugs. We do still have a hell of a lot of stereotypes in society. When we think of drug users and drug addicts, we think of liars, we think of thieves, we think of dishonest people, criminals, and I don't agree with it, but it's definitely absolutely 100% still there. We do predominantly kind of jump to that conclusion instead of thinking about why are they there, what are the factors, what's causing that. So a change in approach, a much more public health-led approach, which could involve decriminalisation and making spaces available so that people can keep themselves safe and they can get access to other services which may help them out of the messes that they've found themselves in, the crises that they've found themselves in. I think that's a very, very positive way to move forward. In terms of how that affects us in Scotland, we're in, again, this tricky position where drugs policy is not a devolved thing. So we are tweaking around the edges, essentially, in Scotland. There's only so much that we can do, but we can't redesign the whole picture because we don't have the power to do it. I would love to see Westminster soften its stance and take a much more open-minded approach, but it would appear under this government, certainly anyway, that that's not going to happen.
As soon as we started talking about this, you at the back, you stuck your hand straight up.
Yeah, well, firstly, just because Boris Johnson decided he fancied a proper Scottish dram and visited us doesn't mean he cares about us. Secondly, I'm a nurse and I don't feel there's enough staff to deal with the sick people that we've got at the moment, let alone staff somewhere.
In terms of safe rooms, you're talking?
That's a safe room, yeah. I don't disagree with a safe room, but I really don't think it's feasible to have medical staff working there.
Okay. And the young man here in the front.
Hi. I think it's quite rich for the Tory government to say, oh, it's the SNP's fault that drugs are so high in Scotland, when it's not a devolved matter. How can you come to the Scottish government and say, oh, you're doing a really bad job here, when it's Tory government that isn't allowing any other leeway to try anything new, when this current system isn't working?
So can you see any... I mean, you had the Health and Social Care Committee, Kirstene, saying just this month that safer rooms should be piloted across the UK. Is this something that you think will get government support?
So,
would you like to see that?
So I agree with Angela that we need to take a different approach, because when I saw those figures, like everybody that read them, they were very difficult reading earlier this year. They were shocking and saddening, and we need to do things differently, 100%. And what I believe is that the consumption rooms in themselves are not a silver bullet. And what the Scottish Affairs Committee report, which has kind of brought this issue up most recently, outlined that there is responsibility on both governments to try to solve or to help this, which a crisis. It's a crisis. And nobody's blaming anybody. And that's why I wasn't agreeing when you were speaking, because actually I recognise that there are both governments play a part in trying to save lives to ensure that we never see figures this high again. And that's why I believe
do you think
the
there should
right
be
thing...
safe rooms as part of a bigger policy?
Well, what's going on is that there's going to be a summit which is chaired by the UK Government Minister Kit Malthouse, and that will bring in the Scottish Government and other stakeholders. And I think that's the point where these issues can be discussed more fully. But I think that cooperation from both sides to help those people that have found themselves in this very devastating situation, and we must reduce the numbers, and that only works when both governments work together on it.
Kit Malthouse, of course, said the summit might not take place this year because of the election, so we need to wait and see what happens about that. Iain?
So I was privileged enough to take part in a debate on this issue earlier in the year here in Scotland. I think, Kirsten, this debate's been taking place for quite some time, and I do think we need to move faster. If someone is injecting themselves, let's be honest, that's what we're talking about. If they are doing that stuff, I would rather get them into a safe place where there can be mental health and social support to turn their lives around. Yeah? Yeah? I mean, the numbers are horrific, are they not? In this city alone, last year, 280 people died because of drug misuse. 280 people died. I mean, we're way beyond now saying it's just a criminal issue. We have to move on. If we are a compassionate society, I believe that's kind of why hopefully we're all sitting around this table. Whatever actors we are, business actors, health professionals, we need to do something about this and stop talking about it.
And do you think safe rooms are the answer or part of the answer?
Well, again, I think we've used the expression earlier this evening, follow the evidence. I think health professionals have moved in this direction. The police have moved in this direction. Social care has moved in this direction. Maybe this is a time where we need to listen to the experts, not the politicians.
Humza.
Can I say I agree with a lot of what's being said here. Let's be clear about it. The numbers of people dying because of drugs death is a stain in our collective consciousness, including from our perspective in the government. But let me just also rise to the challenge, because it'd be very easy to make this an argy-bargy between two governments, but we have to raise ourselves way above that. Yes, I would like the Home Office to allow this city, and it's Glasgow City Council that wants safe consumption rooms, because I agree they're not a panacea, they're not a silver bullet, but nothing is. It has to be a whole suite and a range of measures. But we have to take a public health evidence-led approach. You know, I'm the Justice Secretary. Actually, drugs death rightly doesn't sit with me. It rightly sits with the Public Health Minister. Because if you can deal with the root cause of why people are taking drugs, the poverty, the inequality, the potential dysfunctionality, the fact that they might have had a parent that was taking drugs, if you deal with the root causes, not just the symptoms, but the root causes, then you're going to be far, far, far more effective in terms of in dealing with the issue. And in terms of the evidence that Iain talks about, and he's absolutely right, France has safe consumption rooms, they save lives. Canada has safe consumption rooms, they save lives. Glasgow wants to do it, and my plea genuinely to the Conservatives and to Labour, because we don't know what the result of the election is going to be, that whoever gets in, work with the Scottish Government, let us bring forward safe consumption rooms. If you don't want to change the law, then for goodness, at least devolve the law to us, and we'll change it here so we can finally start to take some very radical and very bold action to make sure we save lives, because inaction is costing us lives.
So, on the whole, I would agree with what everyone is pretty much saying on the issue, but I think, coming to what yourself said, it's not an intravenous drug problem, particularly in Scotland. Drugs are everywhere, particularly for people who are in my generation. I work with young people, and I think that a big issue is drugs are normalised. So talking about it with your friends, talking about it with other young people, it's acceptable. So I think the issue comes down to education, and when you can eradicate that, just as Humza said, at a root level, then you will eradicate the issue much more effectively and save lives as a result.
And how do you think, I mean, Angela was suggesting decriminalisation, for example, and you're expressing concern about the normalisation of drugs. Do you think decriminalisation is part of the answer?
I don't think it's the answer. I think there's definitely, as Kirsten said, you can take a progressive approach. So, like many other European countries, like Holland, for example, they can get your drugs tested. So I think a lot of drug deaths in Scotland came because people don't know what they're taking, and so they'll just take it because their friend is taking it, or they'll take it because it's there, if they're kind of habitual users. So I think what we need to look at is, can we get these substances tested to find out, is that actually what you thought it was? And then we can be looking at, again, a progressive way of solving the issue.
Yes, the man at the back in the blue shirt and glasses.
To pick up on Kirsty's point, you said we need to look in a different direction. The public don't want more direction, they want action. There's too much money wasted on looking at think tanks and millions spent on it that could actually be put into providing these safe rooms that allows people to actually go on with their lives and change society. So I think we need more action rather than more direction.
Barry?
I think what Angela and Iain said is absolutely right. I think it needs to be a public health approach. Iain said, if people are injecting themselves, then it's better that they do so in a safe environment. And that's, of course, that's right. But the real question is, why are they injecting themselves? And that goes to a lack of hope and poverty. And the police distinguish between functional and dysfunctional. And what really makes me sick is when you have middle-class drug users who do not make the connection that actually their habit, their cocaine habit or their habit is actually meaning that some kid is in London, crossing county lines, getting knifed, getting involved in drug culture and the criminality that goes with it.
But coming back to the question, Barry.
Well, I did answer the question in the first...
But if Labour succeed in the general election, would you reconsider the Misuse of Drugs Act and allow safe rooms?
I think we do have to look at a whole public health approach. I don't agree with the decriminalisation element for precisely the reason that was said, and that is that you've got, if you normalise drugs in that way, if you say it's fine, then actually young people will think, actually, that's fine, I'll try it. And I would rather that we deal with the lack of hope, the despair that there is in so many young people, and the dysfunctionality that comes from the poverty and the grinding situation that kids are in, seeing no hope in terms of jobs, no hope in terms of the future. So, yeah, of course, in that sort of situation, they're going to be attracted towards drugs. I want to get them away from that right from the start. And I think you've got to go back to social policy in the way in which you deal with these things, so that you're not in the if situation that Iain was talking about. Of course, if you are, as we are, we've got to deal with that in a public health approach. But let's go further. Let's actually stop people getting snared into it in the first place.
Well, briefly, because we're out of time.
Yeah,
now,
just to point out that decriminalisation and legalisation are not actually the same things. Decriminalisation doesn't go that far, and what it does is it takes the focus away from the individual drug user and it allows the police to focus more on the dealers and the suppliers. So,
Get them to yep.
Well, we could go on talking about this for quite some time, and there's a few of you with your hands up, so apologies I haven't been able to get to you, because I'm afraid our hour is up. Next week we're in Brighton, the week after that we are in Bolton, so come and join us. Call 0330 123 9988 if you'd like to be in the audience, or you can go to the Question Time website. You can follow the instructions there. Or if you want to continue this conversation, and we certainly could have continued it, you can join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time, and that is, as always, on 5 Live now. But for now, thank you very much to my panel, to all of you for coming here tonight, and of course to you at home for watching and for listening from Glasgow. Bye-bye.